If you live in the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, or in another Western developed nation, you've probably seen depictions of Africa in the media that show the continent to be poor, war-torn, and an incredibly difficult place to live. And it's understandable many people think this way. In the 1980s, we were shown images of Bob Geldof in Ethiopia, hand in hand with starving children raising money for the famine that had stricken the nation. In the 1990s, we saw headlines about countless civil wars that took thousands of lives and displaced millions more. This century's immense social media activism surrounding Tony 2012 went mainstream and drew attention to a despicable warlord and his horde of child soldiers. All this pessimism surrounding Africa led to tens of millions of Westerners giving billions in charity to help those on the continent. Now, it is certainly true that many Sub-Saharan African nations are poor compared to developed Western states. In fact, 33 African nations are on the United Nations least developed countries list. In addition, there are violent conflicts breaking out across the continent that are not only killing thousands, but keeping millions more stuck in extreme poverty. If you don't believe me, just Google what is happening in the Sudan, the Eastern DRC, and the Sahel. Nevertheless, it's useful for us to be aware that life for the average African has actually gotten way better over the past few decades. Of course, much more can and needs to be done to take African economies to levels seen in the West, but it remains incredibly useful to track this progress and perhaps, most importantly of all, analyze the mechanisms that promoted this growth. Over the last 20 years, the GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa has increased by a whopping 250%, and per capita incomes have doubled. This leads to wildly better living standards for African peoples. However, it isn't only economics that has changed. Take a look at this graph of child mortality. This shows that child mortality rates have fallen drastically in Africa over the past 40 years. And how about education? Well, over the past 2 decades, literacy rates have increased by 8% in Sub-Saharan Africa. You're probably thinking that 8% isn't very much, but when you recognize that that statistic means 136 million more Africans can read and write since the year 2000, I think you might begin to see how massive of an increase that really is. So what is the reason for such an increase in well-being across the continent? Well, much of this progress started in the late 1990s and has continued through the early decades of the 21st century, which just so happens to be when many African economies began to liberalize their economies and enjoy the wealth that is generated by free and open markets. Much of Africa's post-colonial history was deeply influenced by state-centered, socialist-style economic policies. From 1960 to the mid-1980s, much of Africa dealt with something known as African socialism. Policies such as expropriation of private land, price and wage controls, state-owned enterprises that prevented competition, and more were all too common. Not surprisingly, this type of heavy-handed authoritarian economic philosophy did not lead to a thriving Africa. The late Ghanaian economist George Ayedi sums up the history of African socialism well when he states, "State control created artificial shortages and black markets. State-owned enterprises could not deliver, achieving very low rates of capacity utilization. Most of them were inefficiently run and unprofitable." He also stated that African socialism was a miserable fiasco in country after country, including Angola, Benin, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia, among others. However, finally, things have turned around in Africa. From 1996 to 2021, economic freedom has experienced a long, steady increase. And not surprisingly, many indicators of well-being have gotten better. In 1990, the average Sub-Saharan African nation had a score of 4.77 on the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World report. In 2021, that average African score had risen to 5.95, an increase of about 25%. Economic freedom is absolutely the path forward for African prosperity. More freedom means that people are able to use their capital and labor in ways that are way more productive, efficient, and beneficial for the economy compared to them being forced to work in a particular industry by some centralized power. Wherever economic freedom spreads, prosperity follows. And over the last 2 decades, that freedom has increased in Africa. Now, of course, just because Africa grew for the last 2 decades does not mean that it will continue to do so. And, in fact, there are some worrying signs that many African nations are becoming less economically free. Indeed, we have published videos highlighting the collapse of economic freedom in Rwanda, and we've explored how Botswana's freedom scores have slid, and so too have South Africa's, and Nigeria's, and Egypt's. Not good signs, to say the least. However, by highlighting the immense progress Africa has made over the last 25 years or so, thanks to greater freedom, there is a hope that policymakers across the continent will recognize the value of greater freedom, and as time goes on, it can spread across the region. If this happens, millions of Africans will have richer, healthier, longer, and better lives for decades, if not centuries, to come. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, you may find some of our other work interesting. Check out another video here. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button below, leave a comment, and follow the IATP on Twitter at @the_IATP.